The bride froze. Hundreds of eyes turned to her. The groom smirked, a smirk that felt like a dagger. And then, she did something no one expected. The music stopped, whispers rippled through the crowd, and the church seemed to hold its breath. But before we rush to judge this moment, you need to know, this wasn't a sudden collapse of love. This was years in the making. A quiet storm that had been gathering, hidden behind perfect photos, polite dinners, and words left unsaid. So how did it come to this? Why would a man, on the very day he promised forever, humiliate the woman he claimed to love? And more importantly, what would you have done if you were standing in her shoes, trapped between dignity and destruction? Before we unravel this shocking story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Madison grew up in a small town where neighbors still borrowed sugar from each other, where church bells marked time more reliably than clocks, and where everyone knew everyone else's business. Her father had left before she could even form the word dad, so it was her mother, gentle, hard-working, and endlessly resilient, who raised her. They didn't have much, but Madison never lacked love. She learned to dream not of riches, but of loyalty, of someone who would stay. At night, while her mother mended clothes at the kitchen table, Madison would whisper to herself about the day she'd walk down an aisle, hand in hand with a man who meant every promise. Love to her wasn't luxury. It was safety, it was trust, it was finally belonging to someone who would never leave. And like many women watching today, Madison's hope was as familiar as it was fragile. When Madison first met Ethan, it was at a friend's summer gathering by the lake. He wasn't from her world. His suit looked freshly pressed even in the humid air, and his laughter drew people in like moths to a flame. Ethan was everything she thought she'd never have. Charming, articulate, with the kind of confidence that made her feel both nervous and special at the same time. He noticed her immediately, brushing aside conversations with others to ask about her dreams, her childhood, her favorite books. For Madison, it was intoxicating. Here was a man from a wealthy family, a man who could have chosen anyone, yet he looked at her as if she were the only person in the world. At least that's how it felt in the beginning. And maybe that's what made her ignore the tiny shadows that crept into their conversations. Because from early on, Ethan revealed slivers of himself that Madison chose to overlook. His jokes sometimes carried a sharp edge, disguised as humor, but leaving her cheeks hot with embarrassment when said in front of others. There were phone calls he'd step outside to take, calls that left him returning with a coldness she couldn't explain. Once, when she asked too many questions, he simply smiled and kissed her forehead, whispering, "Don't worry about things you don't need to know." To someone who longed for security, Madison convinced herself these were just quirks of a complicated man. Haven't we all, at some point, made excuses for the person we thought loved us? Haven't we told ourselves, maybe I'm just overthinking it? Madison did the same, because believing in Ethan felt easier than confronting the uneasy truth growing inside her chest. And so, the relationship bloomed on the outside. Dinners at his family's grand home where her small-town manners made her feel both out of place and oddly proud of her simplicity. Vacations she never imagined affording, where Ethan introduced her as the girl who kept him grounded. Madison's mother watched from afar with cautious optimism. She wanted to believe this man was truly different, that he would cherish her daughter. But mothers sense things daughters cannot. And every time Ethan's smile stretched too wide, or his charm felt just a little too rehearsed, Madison's mother would quietly say, "Be careful, honey. Not every man who says he loves you knows what love means." Madison brushed it off, because when you're in love, even warnings from those who love you most can sound like unnecessary fear. What Madison didn't know, and what no one in that small town could have imagined, was that Ethan was carrying a secret that would change everything, a secret that would not stay hidden forever. And the cruelest part, It wouldn't reveal itself in private whispers or quiet confrontations. It would explode into the open on the day she wore her wedding dress, the day everyone she loved gathered to witness her forever, the day Madison's dream of loyalty collided with a reality she could never have prepared for. At first, Madison thought the whispers were just jealousy. A friend from high school pulled her aside one evening and said softly, "He doesn't treat you right, Mads. You deserve better." Madison laughed it off, insisting that Ethan was just under stress, that his sharp words weren't who he truly was. But as weeks turned into months, more voices joined the chorus. A cousin who saw Ethan flirting a little too freely at a party, a co-worker who noticed Madison shrinking when Ethan spoke over her in conversations. Still, Madison defended him. After all, love teaches us to protect the people we choose, even when protecting them means silencing our own doubts. She told herself they didn't understand him the way she did, that they couldn't see the gentle side he revealed only to her. But deep down, her chest carried an unease she couldn't name. The divide between their families only made things harder. Ethan's parents never hid their disdain for Madison's mother. At dinners, they spoke slowly to her, as though kindness needed to be rationed, and complimented Madison with backhanded remarks. "You've come a long way for someone from your background." Madison would clench her fists under the table, forcing a polite smile, while her mother quietly endured. There was one evening when Ethan's mother commented on Madison's future children, saying, "Let's hope they take more after our side of the family." The room went silent, and Ethan only chuckled, sipping his wine. Madison's mother's eyes glistened, but she said nothing. That silence haunted Madison long after, though she tried to bury it under the thought that soon the wedding would wash away all these tensions. Still, a question lingered. If the man you love doesn't defend you, or your family, what does that say about his love? As the wedding approached, the cracks widened. Arguments erupted over things that once seemed trivial: what flowers to choose, which guests to invite, how much money would be spent. Madison dreamed of a simple ceremony with heartfelt vows, but Ethan demanded extravagance. "This is the most important day of our lives," he said, though his tone sounded more like a command than a celebration. When Madison suggested including her childhood pastor to officiate, Ethan brushed it off, insisting on someone from his family's circle. Each disagreement ended the same way: Ethan's voice louder, Madison's softer, until she finally surrendered. She told herself compromise was normal, that couples always fought before weddings. Her mother noticed the tired look in her daughter's eyes and whispered, "It's not supposed to feel like this, sweetheart." But Madison, torn between fear and hope, pushed the warning away. She clung to the image of walking down that aisle, believing that once the vows were spoken, everything would fall into place. Madison's gut tried to speak, but she drowned it out. When she lay awake at night staring at the ceiling, her heart thumped in quiet alarm, yet she soothed herself with excuses. "It's just nerves," she whispered. "Every bride feels overwhelmed before the wedding. This doesn't mean he doesn't love me." She even prayed for calm, asking for a sign that she was making the right choice. But the only sign she received was her own unease, and she refused to listen. Haven't we all, at one point in our lives, ignored the red flags because believing in love felt safer than facing the truth? Have you ever ignored red flags because you wanted to believe in someone? Type yes in the comments. You're not alone. Madison's story is not just her own. It mirrors the choices many of us have made, choosing hope over honesty, comfort over clarity. And yet, beneath her determination to silence the doubts, the truth was waiting. A truth that Ethan carefully tucked behind charming smiles and grand promises. A truth Madison would never uncover in whispered conversations or late-night arguments. Instead, it would reveal itself in the cruelest way imaginable. Not in private, not behind closed doors, but in the open, on the altar, in front of everyone she loved. The moment she dreamed of since childhood would not be remembered for love, but for betrayal. and when it came, it would tear apart her perfect day, piece by piece, in front of hundreds of witnesses. The morning of the wedding arrived like a scene out of a dream. Guests traveled from near and far, filling pews and exchanging whispers about the perfect couple. From the outside, Madison and Ethan seemed like a fairy tale, her grace, his confidence, the kind of union people described as inevitable. The church was dressed in soft ivory and gold, sunlight slipping through stained glass windows, casting colors across the polished wooden floor. The organ began its steady hymn, and all eyes turned as Madison, draped in white, appeared at the entrance. Her mother, trembling but proud, wiped tears from her cheeks. Madison walked slowly down the aisle, her heart pounding. Yet if anyone looked close enough, they'd see her eyes, shining not only with joy but with something else. A flicker of unease. A small shadow of doubt she refused to let break her stride on the most important walk of her life. At the altar, Ethan stood tall, his expression composed for the crowd, but as Madison reached him and their hands met, the mask slipped in subtle ways. He leaned close, his smile never fading, and muttered words only she could hear. "Try not to trip. You wouldn't want to embarrass yourself today." Madison's chest tightened, but she forced a smile for the guests, willing her lips not to tremble. The priest spoke of love and unity, yet beneath the gentle cadence, Ethan whispered again, "Your dress looks cheaper than I expected, but then again, I suppose that's fitting." Madison blinked hard, holding back the sting of tears, silently praying that no one noticed the flicker of pain across her face. It was their day, wasn't it? Surely these words were just nerves, just Ethan's way of masking his own fear. That's what she told herself, even as his grip on her hand grew colder. The vows were supposed to be sacred, a moment when truth and love were declared without pretense. Madison spoke hers softly, her voice quivering yet sincere. She promised loyalty, kindness, and a love that would endure storms. Guests leaned in, some wiping their eyes, touched by her tenderness. And then it was Ethan's turn. He began as expected, words rehearsed, steady, confident. But midway through something shifted. His tone hardened, his smirk stretched, and he raised his voice just enough for the room to hear. "I never thought I'd be marrying a girl who had so little, from a family that could barely give her more than hand-me-down dreams, but here we are." Laughter did not follow. Instead, a gasp rippled through the congregation, shock slicing the air. Madison froze, her cheeks burning, her mother's face paling in horror. Ethan looked at her with a glint of triumph, as if humiliation was a gift he'd saved for this moment. The church filled with murmurs. Guests glanced at one another, some covering their mouths, others shifting uncomfortably in their seats. A woman whispered, "Did he just say that?" while a man shook his head, muttering, "Not here, not today." Madison's heart hammered in her chest, the world spinning around her as Ethan continued, mocking with deliberate cruelty. "I suppose it's noble, really, to rise from nothing. But tell me, do you think love can erase the fact that you'll never truly belong in my world?" His words hung in the air like smoke, choking the beauty out of the room. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Madison's dreams, her years of longing for loyalty, her belief in a love that would save her, all of it threatened to collapse in that single instant. And yet, she did not cry. She did not break. Something within her shifted instead. The silence that followed was unbearable, and still Ethan smirked, waiting for her to crumble in front of the people who had come to celebrate her. But Madison's next move wasn't what he, or anyone else, expected. The bride who had endured whispers, arrogance, and quiet humiliations did something that left the entire church in stunned silence. A move that no one in that moment could have predicted. A move that would echo far beyond the walls of that church. Because instead of breaking down, Madison's next step would change everything. For a split second, Madison felt the weight of every eye in that church pressing down on her. Her cheeks burned, her pulse raced, and a voice deep inside told her to crumble, to cry, to flee. But then another voice, quieter yet stronger, rose up within her. It was the voice she'd heard all her life in the kitchen late at night, steady and warm, the voice of her mother. She remembered the sacrifices her mother had made, working double shifts so Madison could finish school, skipping meals so Madison could eat, whispering prayers over her bed when she thought her daughter was asleep. That memory ignited something fierce inside her. Madison stood taller, her trembling hands growing still. For the first time that day, she did not feel small. She did not feel powerless. She felt something Ethan never expected her to feel in front of him, strength. She turned her gaze to Ethan, locking eyes with him in a way that stripped his smirk of its power. The guests shifted in their seats, bracing for her collapse, but instead, Madison spoke. Her voice wavered at first, but it carried, cutting through the tension. "You think my worth comes from what I have," she said, each word deliberate. "But it comes from who I am. From every sacrifice my mother made so I could stand here. From every ounce of dignity you tried to strip from me with your arrogance." Gasps filled the room again, but this time they were different. Awed, shocked, reverent. Ethan blinked, his smirk faltering, but Madison pressed on. She revealed the truth she had buried for too long, the dismissive jokes, the late-night phone calls, the cold silences, the way he bent love into control. And in front of everyone she tore away the polished mask he wore so easily. The room became a battlefield without weapons. Some of Ethan's relatives leaned toward one another, whispering in defense of their son, murmuring that Madison was emotional or ungrateful. Others, particularly her closest friends and neighbors, sat taller, their faces fierce with pride, silently willing her to keep going. Her mother pressed a hand to her mouth, tears streaking down her face. Not tears of shame, but of recognition. The church pulsed with tension, divided between two truths: the version Ethan had so carefully crafted, and the raw honesty Madison dared to speak. Even the priest faltered, unsure whether to continue the ceremony or pause as Madison's words rang out like judgment. And through it all, Madison's resolve grew sharper, her spirit refusing to bow. But the question lingered heavy in the air, unspoken yet undeniable. Would she continue, binding herself forever to the man who had just humiliated her? Or would she choose the path that terrified her most, walking away from the dream she had clung to since childhood? The crowd waited, holding their breath, as silence stretched longer and longer. Then Madison inhaled deeply, her chest rising with determination. And what she did next was something no one in that church would ever forget. The silence stretched like a taut string, and then Madison broke it, not with tears, but with truth. She turned slowly, no longer speaking only to Ethan, but to every guest seated in that church. Her voice was steady, firm, carrying to the farthest corner. "This isn't love," she declared. "This is control, and I refuse to mistake one for the other." Gasps rippled through the room, a collective intake of breath that seemed to echo against the stained glass walls. Some guests covered their mouths, others nodded in stunned agreement. Ethan stood frozen, the smirk finally gone, his hands twitching at his sides as if searching for a way to reclaim his dominance. Madison didn't give him the chance. She lifted her trembling hand, slipped off the ring that had once symbolized forever, and held it for a moment before pressing it firmly into his palm. She didn't speak another word. The silence of that gesture spoke louder than anything she could have said. Ethan's mask cracked. His charm, so carefully maintained, began to unravel. He let out a laugh that carried no joy, only bitterness. "You'll regret this," he spat, his voice rising. "Who do you think you are? You're nothing without me. Nothing." His words, meant to shame her, only revealed his desperation. The guests recoiled, murmurs spreading like wildfire through the room. Some shook their heads, others whispered sharply, "He's showing his true colors." A friend of Madison's whispered through tears, "She's finally free." Ethan tried to stand taller, puffing out his chest, but every attempt to regain control only humiliated him further. Each outburst stripped away another layer of the man people thought they knew. By the time he finished, he wasn't the composed groom anymore. He was exposed, desperate, and small. And then, quietly but firmly, Madison's mother stepped forward. Her eyes glistened, but her steps were sure. She reached for her daughter's hand and held it tightly, her voice trembling with both pride and relief. "You don't have to stand here another minute," she whispered, though the church was so quiet that many heard it. Madison leaned into her mother's embrace, feeling the weight of years of sacrifice resting beside her, steadying her. The wedding was over, not with applause, not with rings exchanged, but with the dignity of a woman choosing herself over humiliation. The guests slowly rose, some offering applause, others quietly watching with awe, knowing they had just witnessed something unforgettable. Madison may not have left with a husband, but she left with something far greater: her freedom, her courage, her dignity. But was this truly the end of the story? What happened after the walk down the aisle was even more shocking. Madison walked out of the church that afternoon, not as a broken bride, but as a woman reborn. The lace of her gown brushed against the steps as she descended, her mother's hand steadying her side. Behind her, voices still swirled, some in shock, others in admiration, but Madison no longer carried their weight. For the first time in years, she felt light. That day, she lost a husband, but gained something far greater: her freedom. She stepped into the daylight with her head held high, no longer chained to a future built on lies. What was meant to be the most humiliating moment of her life became the beginning of her strength. Word of what happened spread quickly through the town. Some called her brave, others whispered in disbelief, but no one forgot what they had witnessed. Guests who had come expecting vows and celebration instead spoke of her courage, of the dignity with which she faced cruelty and refused to bow to it. Her choice sparked conversations in living rooms, coffee shops, and workplaces about love, about control, about the difference between a fairy tale and the reality of respect. And though Ethan's family tried to spin their own version of the story, it was Madison's truth that resonated, because truth always carries further than deception. And in that truth lies the lesson: dignity and self-respect will always be worth more than status or wealth. Madison didn't leave with a diamond-studded marriage or a wealthy husband's name. She left with her mother's pride, her community's respect, and her own unshakable resolve. Her story is not just about heartbreak, but about the power of walking away when staying means losing yourself, and that's why her moment at the altar will never be remembered as a failure, but as the day she chose herself above all else. If you were in Madison's shoes, what would you have done? Walk away or stay and fight? Let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear your thoughts. She walked away without a husband, but with her pride, her strength, and her mother's love. And sometimes, that's the kind of victory life rewards the most. What happened at that altar wasn't the end of Madison's story. It was the beginning of a life lived on her own terms. A reminder that love without respect is not love at all, and that courage is found not in holding on, but in letting go when holding on costs you everything. In the years to come, people would forget the flowers, the music, even the vows. But they never forgot the sight of a bride who chose dignity over humiliation. That day, Madison didn't just save herself. She showed everyone watching that real strength often comes when we walk away. If this story hit you like it did us, hit that like button. It helps us reach more people. And don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories that prove the strength of the human heart.